The term sundress might originate from the 1940s, but the concept of one has existed long beyond that. Hello and welcome, I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're looking at 100 years of sundresses from 1900 to 1990s. If we think of the sundress as a easy to wear garment that you can just throw on in the extreme heat and still be relatively comfortable and look good, then it has existed for throughout the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, it wouldn't have been called a sundress yet. Instead, for the first couple of decades, it would have been called a lingerie dress. The term lingerie dress comes from the materials used, oftentimes lightweight cottons, linens, or even silks, and along with a lot of lace. They were oftentimes decorated with lace, different sorts of tucks and gathers, which were all very typical things for underwear. So lingerie rather than outerwear. But by the end of the Victorian era, they had also creeped very much into outerwear, and these items were typically called lingerie dresses. In the Edwardian era, dresses were actually typically two-piece garments, and what made them considered a dress rather than separate was the fact that they were a matching set. Because of how much skin it showed during the daytime, I would consider this very much the equivalent of the modern day sundress. And while lingerie dresses like this were typically made out of white fabrics, they could be colored and patterned as well. Simply because the fabrics are so thin, you can just have yards and yards of fabric and still have the garment itself be rather lightweight and very airy and feminine. The silhouette of that first decade is very voluminous, very curvy, very feminine. We emphasize curves, we can pad things out, and there's yards and yards of fabric in the dresses, and the dresses oftentimes have trains to them. But that all changes as we get into the second decade, the 1910s. Then the silhouette becomes a lot more streamlined, the silhouette comes a lot closer to the body, and the body becomes a lot more natural. The curves become much more subtle. We don't overemphasize any one aspect of the body, and the overall lines become a lot more straight and narrow rather than wide and curvy. And of course, that means that the train goes into evening wear and goes away from daytime wear, where the hems start to rise higher and higher as the decade progresses. And so the lingerie dress changes with the fashions. It becomes a one-piece item. It is usually called either a semi-princess or princess style because of the bodice and the skirt being attached. They can sometimes have a clear waist seam to them. Sometimes they can be clearly a one-piece garment. These kind of garments oftentimes close in the back, and they are still made out of these lingerie materials. They still have a ton of lace and details on them. They are still very ethereal, very feminine, and very romantic. This particular dress is from 1912, and it has that Titanic era silhouette to it. The skirt is still very narrow. That does spread out as the decade progresses, but the general shape of the body doesn't really change, nor does the lingerie dress itself. It is still very much made out of lingerie materials, and it can very oftentimes show the undergarments through it, the outer garments. That's why you would typically have a semi-princess or princess slip underneath. And just like in the previous decade, these do not need to always be white. And even if the outer garment is white, the slip underneath doesn't need to be white. And especially in the beginning of the decade, the bodice is oftentimes cut in a kimono shape, meaning that the sleeves and the bodice is cut in one piece. These can sometimes have a seam at the waist, but they don't always have that. It really depends not only on the design of the garment and especially the design of the lace insertion, but also on the wearer's personal taste. And the sundress of the 1920s is probably the most iconic dress of the 1920s, the one-hour dress. The one-hour dress can be made in various forms. It can be also very much an afternoon or even evening gown, or it can be a very casual, very sporty garment. It really depends a lot on the materials themselves, whether it could be classified as a sundress or not. And this is the decade where we really get into that sundress length, that about knee length, that is more typical of the modern day sundress. Well, in general, the hems creep up as the 1920s progress, though I have to mention that there is definitely times in the 1920s when the hemlines are ankle length. So just because we most associate those shorter hemlines with the 1920s doesn't mean that that was the only thing they had. And though this still has the t-shirt sleeves, it only has a few closures up on the bra strap area and then lower down on the arm. So it creates that kind of peekaboo effect. And though this version is in a patterned cotton, they could also be in one color, and they could oftentimes have also embroidery and things like that. In general, the idea of this dress was that you could complete it in 1 hour, but that of course requires a very experienced seamstress and one who is very familiar with this style of making dresses and has probably made several before. And another thing worth mentioning in the 1920s is that even though the gloche hat is most definitely the most iconic hat of the 1920s, they did have sun hats, especially for the first half of the decade. And then as we get into the 1930s, the silhouette again changes radically. We come again back to that more feminine, more curvy body, but again, a very natural silhouette and with very little emphasis on hips. So you don't want hips to be extremely wide. You want a narrower silhouette. But instead of creating this with extreme corsetry, this was mostly created by an illusion, by the shape of the garment. The goal of the garments was basically to have a fairly tall silhouette of a feminine body, but a feminine, like fairly athletic body. Not super curvy, but not super straight either. Not a boyish silhouette like in the 1920s. And that led to a lot of sportswear and sportswear inspired looks. And that's why the basic sundress of the 1930s was the sports dress. And this is also the decade when the sundress really loses its sleeves. The sleeveless look becomes acceptable for daytime, and it becomes even considered sporty. And another kind of odd feature of these sundresses of the 30s is that a lot of them have a really, really low back or cutout back detailing or other detailing like this that is not very, like, if we think that you need a sports bra underneath sports clothes, it's very counterintuitive towards that sort of thinking, because with these styles, oftentimes you can't really wear any kind of bra. Sure, they did have low-backed bras, but with this style, where are you, like, there's no place for the straps to go. So yeah, it doesn't really work. This dress, like a lot of the other sports dresses, weren't actually meant for like sports, but rather athleisure wear. Then as we head into the 1940s, we come to what we would consider a sundress. You can instantly recognize that this dress is clearly a sundress. It has the straps, it is the light flowy material, it is about knee length, and it does have a little bit more of a flare to the hem, but it is not huge. It is not cumbersome. It is very easy to wear, and in this era, the backless style goes away, but the neckline becomes a huge point of interest. You can have basically any sort of neckline that you want. But unlike most day dresses of this decade, they don't have a lot of details or a lot of embellishment on them. And that really continues into the 1950s. Even though the 1950s silhouette tends to be, in general, more of a full skirt, a very full skirt, or than a pencil skirt, the sundresses of this era oftentimes omit all the underlayers and just go for a fairly straight A-line skirt. But that doesn't mean that they don't still appeal to the new look silhouette. Though they oftentimes had pockets that would emphasize the hips and cuts that would really draw the eye towards the curves, creating an illusion of much more curves than there necessarily even is. So it still kept up with the silhouette of the 1950s, just less exaggerated and requiring a lot less of those hot underlayers. Because in the 1950s, you have to remember that the underlayers oftentimes aren't natural fibers anymore. They are oftentimes different kinds of nylons and other synthetics. So those layers, especially big poofy skirts, can get really hot. And with this 1950s dress, I've included a detail that was common also in the 30s and 40s and continued into the 50s, and that is the bolero jacket. Because the sundresses themselves don't offer really sun protection, oftentimes it was considered appropriate to have a little bolero jacket that you could cover your shoulders with. These jackets typically had t-shirt sleeves. They were fairly simple garments, and they usually either ended slightly above the waist or at the waist, never lower than that really. They were typically made either in the same fabric or a contrast fabric with little details like trimming or collars made out of the same fabric as the dress. The 1960s fashion is largely just a continuation of the 1950s fashion, with a lot of the fuller skirts and the pencil skirts. But there is a drastic change, and that is to that A-line skirt. That A-line that is in the 50s, first a fitted bodice and then an A-line skirt, becomes a full A-line dress. So it starts basically from the shoulders down, and it continues in a full A-line without a defined waist. This type of mod dress or A-line dress is very typical of especially the second half of the decade, and it shows up both in day wear, evening wear, all different categories of dresses, but none more than the sundress. This particular dress, actually, I would not consider this quite a sundress because the material is a little bit too fine, and especially with the trimming around the neck. And while especially the version for adults and especially a sundress would be about knee length, the younger generations, especially teenagers, would very oftentimes hem theirs a lot shorter, and they could go even to extremely short, like micro mini level, what would even be considered quite risque today. Even though in the 1960s it was very common to have just bare legs with sundresses, another option was to have different sorts of colorful stockings. Stockings in the 1960s typically didn't anymore have that seam. That seam existed in the earlier stockings, not really because of looks, but rather because of the way they were manufactured. But in the 1960s, the machines changed so that we could manufacture seamless stockings. These colorful stockings could either be matching with the dress, especially if you had a different color for shoes and bags and things like that, then it was very common to match them to the dress, or they could be in a contrast color. You could wear very wild combinations, especially if you then continued one of the colors, either the stockings color or the dress's color, in your accessories. And while those wild patterns from the 1960s continue into the 1970s, they change a bit because the 1970s really is like an era of nostalgia as far as clothing goes. There's a lot of like 1970s does Edwardian, does Victorian, does 1940s, and this sundress is a very typical example of that. This is very clearly a 1970s does 1940s. So much so that if you would style it differently and wear the different kind of undergarments, the ones that were more typical of the 1940s, and styled your hair, you probably wouldn't even be able to guess that it is actually from the 1970s unless you look at the seam detailing on the inside and things like that. I wanted to include this particular dress because it is such an iconic, like, throwback style, even though it does kind of deviate a little bit from that typical sundress aspect because it does, in fact, have sleeves. Whereas in the 1970s, you definitely could have sundresses that didn't have sleeves, that had just the straps, very much like modern dresses. While the 1970s has that huge throwback from the Edwardian era in the 1940s, in the 1980s, that is mostly 1950s and 1920s, which seems kind of counterintuitive since those are very different silhouettes, but both of them had a huge resurgence in a very 1980s way. So one key thing of these throwback eras is always that even though it is clearly a throwback to a certain other era in time, you can usually typically say very clearly that this is not an actual 1940s piece, but a 1980s piece or 1970s piece. Or this is not an Edwardian piece, this is 1970s. Or this is, in fact, not a 1920s piece, but a 1980s piece. Though sometimes these lines do get a little blurred, usually you can't tell. In the 1980s, there are so many different styles of sundresses that I could have chosen, but I decided to go for this one in particular because it is such a clear throwback to the 1920s. And it has all those iconic features that I think make a really good sundress. So it doesn't have any sort of sleeve. It is casual, easy to wear. You can just throw it on. It is loose. It is cotton. It is comfortable. And it looks really cute. But again, because this is the 1980s rather than the 1920s, it is styled differently. But not only is the hair and makeup different, but also the key feature is that the undergarments are very different. You don't have anymore a corset underneath. You don't have that bra, that brassiere that like is meant to flatten your bust, but rather it emphasizes your bust in a very 1980s way. In 1980s, there's so many different options to choose from that you can't really say that there's only one clear silhouette. Like in the previous eras, there has typically been a very clear silhouette to the body, the one that we want to create. But in the 1980s, though there is this tendency towards this more triangular body shape where you are more wide on the shoulder line and then have a more narrow waist and hip area, that isn't always the case. Some styles very much make you into an hourglass, and some styles very much make you into rather like straight up and down style, especially like those throwbacks to the 1920s styles. And another key thing of the 1980s is that this is really the last decade where a slip is always worn underneath a dress. Then, unfortunately, in the 90s, us millennials stop using a slip, and then it kind of snowballs from there and the slip goes away. So sorry to everyone who has to now contend with no slips, because it really does change how the garment hangs on you, and it actually makes you hotter. Because the slip is there to keep the friction from happening. It is there to wick away sweat. It makes everything so much better. So if you can wear a slip with a dress, even if it's a modern dress, even if you're not going for any sort of historical elements, no history bounding, nothing, please try on a slip. It will absolutely change how your dress fits you, and especially shorter skirts, if they have a tendency of rising up, wearing a slip underneath will keep that from happening. And then appropriately, since we stop wearing a slip underneath our dresses in the 1990s, we start wearing basically a slip as the dress, but made, of course, of non-lingerie materials. And because this is still a sundress, it has those key features of not being super tight. It has that beautiful drape. It is slightly longer, and it has that tie-in to create that like illusion of more that 90s silhouette, while still being loose and comfortable and easy to wear, and also very adjustable so that many different body types can wear this. And in the 1990s, even though there are still cotton sundresses, viscose fibers really take over the cotton, especially in the sundress category, because the garments themselves are fairly simple in cut. In the 90s, it just, that extra like flowiness from the hang of different sorts of rayons just lends itself better to that shape. So much like fashion in general changes a lot in the 20th century, and the silhouette of the fashion changes, even the sundress, with its much more casual silhouette, still changes quite a bit and drastically, and you can clearly see the difference in body shape. Not only from the undergarments, even though those do have an impact, but on the dress itself. Was there any decade that really surprised you? Some silhouette or some style that you really weren't expecting? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Well, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this universe. And if you haven't already subscribed and you'd like to do that, then go ahead and do that now so that I can see you again next time. I really hope I do. And me and Noodle say bye. Yeah. Morning. Yeah. Good morning. That's my mic. Don't eat that. Let's say hi to all the people on the internet. See, there's a little Noodle. Yeah. Oh, I get Noodle kisses again. Yeah. I get Noodle kisses. And a big yawn. Yeah. Noodle just woke up. Yeah. Let's say hi to the internet. Or bye to the internet. Bye. Okay. Yeah. We'll go outside. We'll go pee.